It was Swami Bhaktivedanta. His forehead was painted with a wide V-shaped sign, and his eyes were half shut. He seemed very serene. Harvey tried, but he couldn't do the Raja Yoga. He was new to Ananda Ashram and had only come up for a weekend retreat. During his morning meditation, he found himself more attracted to the green mist above the lake outside the window than to the circle on the wall he was supposed to be meditating on. Harvey, I went to my room. The rain was increasing and beating against the windows. It was peaceful, and I was glad to be alone. I read for a while. Suddenly, I sensed someone standing in the doorway. Looking up, I saw it was the Swami. He was wrapped in his pink blanket like a shawl. Can I come in? He asked. I nodded yes, and he asked if he could sit in the chair in the corner. What are you reading? He smiled. Kafka's Diaries, I replied, feeling a little embarrassed. Ah, he said, and I put the book down. He asked what I was doing at the ashrama and if I was interested in yoga. What kind of yoga are you studying? I don't know much about it, I answered, but I think I'd like to study Hatha yoga. This didn't impress him. There are better things to do than this, he explained. There are higher, more direct forms of yoga. Bhakti yoga is the highest. It is the science of devotion to God. As he spoke, I got the overpowering realization that he was right. He was speaking the truth. A creepy, ecstatic sensation came over me, and that this man was my teacher. His words were so simple, and I kept looking at him all weekend. He would sit so calm and dignified with warmth. And he asked me to visit him when we got back to the city. Dr. Mishra would give lectures carrying the impersonal interpretation of Bhagavad Gita according to Shankara, and Prabhupada, when allowed to speak, would counter them. Once Prabhupada asked Dr. Mishra to help him in spreading Lord Chaitanya's movement, but Dr. Mishra sidestepped Prabhupada by saying that he considered Prabhupada an incarnation of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and therefore not in need of help. Prabhupada replied that since Mishra was also the name for Lord Chaitanya's father, Dr. Mishra should help spread Lord Chaitanya's movement. Srila Prabhupada offered to engage him in checking the Sanskrit on his translations of Srimad Bhagavatam, but Dr. Mishra declined, a decision he later regretted. Herta Lurch, a student in Ananda Ashram. My direct encounter with him was in the kitchen. He was very particular and very definite that he would only eat what he cooked himself. He would come and say, get me a pot. So when I brought him a pot, he'd say, no, bigger. So I brought a bigger pot and he'd say, no, smaller. Then he would say, give me a potato. So I'll bring a potato. He prepared food very, very quietly. He never spoke very much. He prepared potatoes and then some vegetables and then chapatis. After cooking, he would eat outside. He would usually cook enough to go around for Dr. Mishra about 5 or 6 other people. Every day he would cook that much when he was there. I learned to make chapatis from him. He usually stayed only for the weekends and then went back to the city. I think he felt that was there with his main work. I think he felt that was where his main work was to be done. That was certainly true, but what could he do there with no money or support? He was thinking of staying only for a few weeks and then go back to India. In the meantime, he was working on his Srimad Bhagavatam manuscripts, walking in Manhattan and writing letters. He was studying a new culture, calculating practicality and imagining hopefully how to introduce Krishna consciousness to the Western world. He expressed his thoughts to Sumati Morarji, October 27. So far as I have studied, the American people are very much eager to learn about the Indian way of spiritual realization. And there are so many so-called yoga ashrams in America. Unfortunately, they are not very much adored by the government. And it is learned that just yoga ashrams have exploited the innocent people, and has been the case in India also. The only hope is that they are spiritually inclined and immense benefit that can be done to them if the cult of Srimad Bhagavatam is preached there. Srila Prabhupada noted that the Americans were also giving a good reception to Indian art and music. Just to see the mode of reception, he attended the performance of a Madrasi dancer, Bala Saraswati. I went to see a dance with a friend, although for the last 40 years I have never attended such dance ceremonies. The dancer was successful in her demonstration. The music was an Indian classical tune, mostly in Sanskrit language, and the American public appreciated them, so I was encouraged to see the favored circumstances about my future preaching work. He said the Bhagavatam could also be preached through music and dance, but he had no means to introduce it. The Christian missions, backed by huge resources, were preaching all over the world, so why couldn't the devotees of Krishna combine to preach the Bhagavatam all over the world? He also noted that the Christian missions had not been effective in checking the spread of communism, whereas the Bhagavatam movement could be because its philosophical, scientific approach. He was deliberately planting a seed of inspiration in the mind of the devoted wealthy Sumati Morarji. November 8. Prabhupada wrote to his godbrother Tirtha Maharaja, who had become president of the Gaudiya Mass, to remind him that the spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, had a strong desire to open preaching centers in the Western countries. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had several times attempted to do this by sending sannyasis to England and other European countries, but Prabhupada noted without any tangible results. I have come to this country with the same purpose in view. As far as I can see, here in America, there is a very good scope for preaching the cult of Lord Chaitanya. Prabhupada pointed out that there were certain Mayavadi groups who had buildings but were not attracting many followers. But he had talked with Swami Nikhilananda of the Ramakrishna mission, who had given the opinion that the Americans were suitable for Bhakti Yoga. I'm here and see a good field for work, but I'm alone, without men and money. To start center here, we must have our own buildings. If the leaders of the Gaudiya Mass would consider opening their own branch in New York, Srila Prabhupada would be willing to manage it. But without their own house, he reported, they could not conduct a mission in the city. Srila Prabhupada wrote that they could open centers in many cities throughout the country. If his godbrothers would cooperate, he repeatedly made the point that although other groups did not have the genuine spiritual philosophy of India, they are buying many buildings. The Gaudiya Math, however, had nothing. If you agree to cooperate with me, as I have suggested above, then I shall extend my visa period. My present visa period ends by the end of this November, but if I receive your confirmation immediately, then I shall extend my visa period. Otherwise, I shall return to India. November 9, 6 p.m. While Prabhupada sat alone in his fifth floor room in Dr. Mishra's yoga studio, the light suddenly went out. This was his experience of the first moments of New York City blackout in 1965. In India, power failure occurred commonly, so Prabhupada, while surprised to find the same thing in America, remained undisturbed. He began chanting the Hare Krishna mantra on his beads. Meanwhile, outside his room, the entire New York metropolitan area had been plunged into the darkness. The massive power failure had suddenly left the entire city without electricity, trapping 800,000 people in the subways and affecting more than 30 million people in 9 states and 3 Canadian provinces. 2 hours later, a man from Mishra's apartment arrived at the door with candles and some fruit. He found Prabhupada in a pleasant mood, sitting there in the darkness, chanting Hare Krishna. The man informed him that the serious nature of such blackout in New York City. Prabhupada thanked him and returned again to his chanting. The blackout lasted until 7 the next morning. Srila Prabhupada received a reply to his letter on November 8 to Sirta Maharaja in Calcutta. Prabhupada had explained his hopes and plans for staying in America, but he had said that his godbrothers would have to give him their vote of confidence as well as some tangible support. His god brothers had not been working cooperatively. Each leader was interested more in maintaining his own building than in working with the others to spread the teachings of Lord Chaitanya around the world. So how would it be possible for them to share Srila Prabhupada's vision of establishing a branch in New York? They would see it as his separate attempt. Yet despite the unlikely odds, he appealed to their missionary spirit and reminded them of the desires of their spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura. The Guru Maharaj wanted Krishna consciousness to be spread in the West. But when Prabhupada finally got Tirtha Maharaj's reply, he found it unfavorable. His godbrother did not argue against his attempting something in New York, but he politely said that the Gaudiya Mass funds could not be used for such proposal. Prabhupada replied, "It is not very encouraging, still I am not a man to be disappointed." In fact, he found a little hope in Tirtha Maharaj's reply. So he described to his godbrother the property he had recently found for sale at 143 West 72nd Street. The building, only 18 and a half feet wide and 100 feet deep, consisted of the first floor store, a basement, and a mezzanine. Prabhupada presented Tirtha Maharaj price 100,000 with a 20,000 cash down payment and remarked that this building was twice the size of the Research Institute in Calcutta. Prabhupada conceived of the basement as a kitchen and dining area, the first floor as a lecture hall, and the mezzanine as a personal apartments with a separate area for the deity of Lord Krishna. Appropriately, Prabhupada had described himself as a man not to be disappointed. He was convinced that if there were a center where people could come near from a pure devotee, the genuine God-conscious culture of India could begin in America. Yet because he had made his plans dependent on obtaining the expensive building in Manhattan, his goal seemed unreachable. Still, he was persistently writing to prominent devotees in India, though they were not interested in his plans. Why should they not help? He thought. After all, they were devotees of Krishna. Shouldn't the devotees come forward to establish the first Krishna temple in America? Certainly he was qualified and authorized to spread the message of Krishna. As for the place, New York was perhaps the most cosmopolitan city in the world. He had found the building not very expensive, a good location, and there was a great need for Krishna temples here to offset the propaganda of the Indian Mayavadis. The Krishna Bhaktas to whom he was writing understood Lord Krishna to be not simply a Hindu deity, but the Supreme Lord, worshipable for the whole world. So they should be pleased to see Krishna worshipped in New York. Krishna himself said in the Bhagavad Gita, "Give up all other duties and surrender to me." So if they were Krishna's devotees, why would they not help? What kind of devotee was it who did not want to glorify the Lord? But Srila Prabhupada did not judge beforehand who would serve Krishna's mission and who would not. He was fully surrendered and fully dependent on Krishna, and in obedience to his spiritual master, he would approach everyone without discrimination to ask for help. There was Sumati Morarji. She had helped him in publishing the Bhagavatam, and she had seen him to America. In a recent letter to her, he had only given hints. I'm just giving you the idea, and if you kindly think over the matter seriously and consult your beloved Lord Bala Krishna, surely you will be further enlightened in the matter. There is scope that there is certainly necessity also, and it is the duty of every Indian, especially the devotees of Lord Krishna, to take up the matter. But he had received no reply. He had not heard from her since Butler, though her words to him had seemed prophetic, and they had stuck with him. I feel that you should stay there until you fully recover from your illness and return only after you had completed your mission. Now Sukmaji Morarji must do something big, he told her point blank. I think, therefore, a temple of Balakrishna in New York may immediately be started for this purpose. And as a devotee of Lord Balakrishna, you should accede to this great and noble work. Till now, there is no worshipable temple of the Hindus in New York, although in India, there are so many American missionary establishments and churches. So I shall request you to do this noble act, and it will be recorded in the history of the world that the first Hindu temple is started by a pious Hindu lady, Srimati Sumati Morarji, who is not only a big business magnate in India, but a pious Hindu lady and a great devotee of Lord Krishna. This task is for you and glorious at the same time. He assured her that he had no ambition to become a proprietor of a house or temple in America, but for preaching, a building would be absolutely required. They should have association of bona fide devotees of the Lord. They should join the curtain glorifying the Lord. They should hear the teachings of Srimad Bhagavatam. They should have an intimate touch with the temple or place of the Lord. And they should be given ample chance to worship the Lord in the temple. Under the guidance of the bona fide devotee, they can be given such facilities. And the way of the Srimad Bhagavatam is open for everyone. He informed her that he had located a building just suitable for this great missionary work. It was ideal, as if it was built for this purpose only. And your simple willingness to do the act will complete everything smoothly. The house is practically 3 stories, ground floor, basement, and 2 stories up, with all the suitable arrangements for gas, heat, etc. The ground floor may be utilized for preparation of prasadam of Balakrishna, because the preaching center will not be for dry speculation, but for actual gain, for delicious prasadam. I have already tasted how the people here like the vegetable prasadam prepared by me. They will forget meat eating and pay for the expenses. American people are not poor men like the Indians, and if they appreciate a thing, they are prepared to spend any amount on such hobby. They are being exploited simply by jugglery of words and bodily gymnastics, and still they are spending for that. But when they will have an actual commodity and feel pleasure by eating very delicious prasadam of Balakrishna, I am sure a unique thing will be introduced in America. Now, according to his plans, he had a week left in America. My term to stay in America will be finished by the 17th of November, 1965. But I am believing in your foretelling. You should stay there until you're fully recovered your health and return after you have completed your mission. The Tagore Society of New York Incorporated cordially invites you to a lecture, God Consciousness, by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Date Sunday, November 28, 1965. Time, lecture, 3:30 p.m. T, 4:30 p.m. Place, New India House. City is 64th Street, a widely respected scholar and religious leader in India. Swami Bhaktivedanta is briefly visiting New York. He has been engaged in a monumental endeavor of translating the 60-volume Srimad Bhagavatam from Sanskrit to English.
Namo Vishnu Krishna Krishna Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Dinamini Namaste Saraswati Gaurvani Pracharini Nirvishesha Shanmadi Paschata Deshatapi Continuing reading of chapter 14. November 28th. Daud Harun had never met Srila Prabhupada. He was a musician living downtown and he used to attend the meetings of the Tagore Society up on 64th Street. Daud Haroon. I went uptown and walked into the auditorium, and I noticed that the stage was empty and a few people were sitting towards the rear of the auditorium. I walked forward down the center aisle because I usually like to sit up front. Then I saw an old gentleman sitting over to the right, and he sort of drew me over to him. So I went over and sat beside him, and then noticed that he was saying his beads. Even though he had his beads in a bag, I could hear him. I could see his body moving, and I felt very comfortable because this was something I was used to. As I was sitting there looking around the auditorium, he just turned around and smiled at me very nicely. He nodded his head, and I nodded my head, and he smiled and turned around. He turned back to me again and softly asked me if I was from India. I said, "No, sir, I'm not from India. I'm from here, the United States." He turned back and he kept chanting with his beads. Then he turned around the next time and asked if I was a Hindu. I said, "No, sir, I'm not a Hindu, I'm a Muslim." And he said, "Oh, very good, very good. Yes, many times I hear the children in India reciting the Quran." And then he turned back around and his body was moving, rocking, and he was working with his beads. Then there were a few more exchanges of pleasantries, sort of intermittent. And then a lady came up on the stage and announced that the lecture was to begin. And if the folks could give the speaker a round of applause, they would welcome him to the stage. At that point, the man I was sitting next to put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Excuse me, sir, would you do me a favor?" And I said, "Yes, anything." He said, "Would you watch over my books?" I looked down on the floor and he had several boxes of books and an umbrella and several other articles. I said, "Yes, I will watch over these." And he said, "Excuse me." And he walked up to the aisle and surprisingly he walked up on the stage. And it was a man I had come to hear, Swami Bhakti Vedanta. He walked up on the stage and introduced himself to the people and tried to get them to come forward. He said, "Come forward, come forward." A few of them came up to the front. There were mixed couples, many Indians, male and female, mostly middle aged and some college aged. A lot of professor types and ladies were there. Then he began his speech. He dove right into it. He just started exclaiming, proclaiming the greatness of the Creator, and that the most important thing is to remember the Creator and remember God. He began to expand on God consciousness, what God consciousness is, and how God is everywhere, and how it behooves us all to remember God, no matter what we call Him, what names we call Him by, but that we should call Him. He gave a demonstration which was very moving. He chanted Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, and spoke about the power and saving grace in the mantra. He took a little break about halfway through and had some water. The last thing he said as he was coming down from the podium was that he had copies of the Srimad Bhagavatam. He explained that he had been working on them and that they came in 3 volumes and were $16. Then he concluded and came down. A lot of people went over to him. Some were timid, some were enthusiastic. Some people shook his hand and were asking for books. At first, there were about 15 people gathered around him, talking to him and asking questions. With so many people around, he came over to me and said, Sir, would you do me one more favor? Will you kindly take over the selling of the books? People will be coming to you for the books, so you sell the books and put the money in this little box, and I will be with you in a minute. And I said, Fine. So while he talked to the people, others came up to me. They must have thought I was somehow his secretary or his traveling companion. And people were coming over to me and asking me personal questions about him, which I couldn't really answer because I didn't know. Some people were buying the books or looking through them. So this went on, and I was trying to listen to him carry on his conversations with people and carry on the book selling at the same time. Some of the people were looking for a guru and trying to find out what he was supposed to be. Some of them were really interrogating him, but he just smiled and answered all their questions simply. I remember he told them, You will know there is no pressure. You will know if I am your guru. He suggested that people go over and read the books. And then the group dwindled down to about a half a dozen. And the few remaining were just looking at him, and some were too timid to approach him. He walked over to them and spoke to them, putting them at ease. Later, he came over and he counted the collection, and I helped him pack up his box, carry downstairs the boxes of books that were left. As we parted, he thanked me very much, and I gave him my name and address and phone number and purchased a set of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Chapter 15. It will not be possible to assist you. I have come here in this old age neither for sightseeing nor for any personal interest. It is for the interest of the entire humanity that I am trying to implement the science of Krishna, which will actually make them happy. So it is the duty of every devotee of Lord Krishna to help me by all means. From a letter to Sumati Morarji. November passed and December came, and Prabhupada, having obtained an extension of his visa, stayed on. America seemed so opulent, yet many things were difficult to tolerate. The sirens, the bells from the fire engines, and police cars seemed like they would crack his heart. Sometime at night, he would hear a person being attacked and crying for help. From his first days in the city, he had noted that the smell of dog stool was everywhere. And although it was such a rich city, he could rarely find a mango to purchase. And if he did, it was very expensive and usually had no taste. From his room, he would sometimes hear the horns of ocean liners, and he would dream that someday he would sail around the world with a Sankirtana party preaching in all the major cities of the world. The weather kept blowing, the weather went below freezing, colder than he had ever experienced in India. Daily, he had to walk towards the Hudson against a west wind that, even on an ordinary winter day, would take your breath away and make your eyes water and your face grow numb. On a stormy day, the driving wind and sudden gusts could even knock a man down. Sometimes a cold rain would turn the streets sleek with ice. The cold would become especially severe as one approached the shelterless, windswept area of West Side Drive, where occasional whirlwinds carried brown leaves and paper trash mysteriously high into the sky, into the air. Srila Prabhupada wore a coat Dr. Mishra had given him, but he never gave up wearing his dhoti despite the cold, the windy walks. Swami Nikhalananda of the Ramakrishna mission had advised Prabhupada that if he wanted to stay in the West, he should abandon his traditional Indian dress and strict vegetarianism. Meat eating and liquor, as well as pants and hose, were almost a necessity in this climate, he had said. Before Prabhupada had left India, one of his godbrothers had demonstrated to him how he should eat in the West with a knife and fork. But Prabhupada never considered taking on Western ways. His advisors cautioned him not to remain an alien, but to get into the spirit of American life, even if it meant breaking vows he had held in India. Almost all Indian immigrants compromised their old ways. But Prabhupada's idea was different and he could not be budged. The others may have had to compromise, he thought, but they had come to beg technological knowledge from the West. I have not come to beg something, he said, but to give something. In his solitary wanderings, Srila Prabhupada made acquaintances with a number of local people. There was a Mr. Rubin, a Turkish Jew, who worked as a New York City subway conductor. Mr. Rubin met Prabhupada on a park bench and, being a social fellow and a world traveler, sat and talked with the Indian holy man, Mr. Rubin. He seemed to know that he would have temples filled with devotees. He would look out and say, I'm not a poor man, I'm rich. There are temples and books, they're existing, they are there. But the time is separating us from them. He always mentioned we and spoke about the one who had sent him, his spiritual master. He didn't know people at that time, but he said, I'm never alone. He always looked like a lonely man to me. That's what made me think of him like a holy man, Elijah, who always went out alone. I don't believe he had any followers. When the weather was not rainy or icy, Prabhupada would catch the bus to Grand Central Station and visit the Central Library on 42nd Street. His Srimad Bhagavatams were there, some of the same volumes he had sold to the US Embassy in New Delhi, and he took pleasure in seeing them listed in the card catalog and learning that they were being regularly checked out and read. He would sometimes walk through the UN Plaza and walk up to New India House on 64th Street, where he had met Mr. Malhotra, a consulate officer. It was through Mr. Malhotra that he had contacted the Tagore Society and had secured an invitation to lecture before one of their meetings back in November. Riding the bus down the 55th Avenue, he would look out at the buildings and imagine that someday he could be used in Krishna consciousness. He would take a special interest in certain buildings, one on the 23rd Street and one with the dome on 14th Street attracted his attention. He would think of how the materialistics had constructed such elaborate buildings and yet made no provisions for spiritual life. Despite all the great achievements of technology, the people felt empty and useless. They had built these great buildings, but the children were going to LSD. December 2nd, New York Times headlines. New York City hospitals report marked rise in LSD cases admitted for care. Protest against US participation in Vietnam War mounts. The weather grew cold, but there was no snow in December. On Columbus Avenue, shops were selling Christmas trees, and the continental restaurants were bright with holiday lightings. On 72nd, the Retailers Association erected tall red poles topped with green tinsel Christmas trees. The tops of the trees on both sides of the street sprouted tinsel garlands that spanned the street and joined in red tinsel stars surrounded by colored lights. Although Srila Prabhupada had no Christmas shopping, he visited many bookstores. Orientalia, San Vicer's, Doubleday, The Paragon, and others trying to sell his Srimad Bhagavatams. Mrs. Ferber, the wife of the Paragon Book Gallery proprietor, considered Prabhupada a pleasant and extremely polite small gentleman. The first time he called, she wasn't interested in his books, but he tried again, and she took several volumes. Prabhupada used to stop by about once a week, and since his books were selling regularly, he would collect. Sometimes, when he needed copies to sell personally, he would come by and pick them up from Mrs. Ferber, and sometimes he would phone to ask her how his books were selling. Mrs. Ferber, every time he came, he would ask for a glass of water. If a customer would make such a request, I would ordinarily say there is the water cooler. But because he was an old man, I couldn't tell him that, of course. He was very polite always, very modest, and a great scholar. So whenever he would ask, I would fetch him a cup of water personally. Once Prabhupada was talking with Mrs. Ferber about Indian cuisine, and she mentioned that she especially liked samosas. The next time he paid her a visit, he brought a tray of samosas which she enjoyed. Harvey Cohen came often to room 501 to visit the Swami who had so impressed him at Ananda Ashram. Harvey. The room he occupied was a tiny office in the back of the Yoga Society in uptown Manhattan. I began to go there regularly, and we sat facing each other on the floor in his little office with his typewriter and a new tape recorder on top of two suitcases. And there was a box of books he had brought from India and a colored reproduction of dancing figures which he looked at often. I told Swami Bhaktivedanta that I was an artist, and he asked me to please paint the picture of the dancers, which he explained was of Lord Chaitanya and his disciples. The paintings were called Sankirtana. Whenever I came to visit him, Swami would always be happy to see me. I told him about myself, and we chanted Hare Krishna together in his room many nights that winter. I would get the train uptown from my apartment to go see him. January 11, 1966. Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri died of a heart attack while visiting Russia. The Prime Minister had been a personal acquaintance of Srila Prabhupada's in India and an admirer of his Srimad Bhagavatam translation. He had been scheduled to visit America, and Prabhupada had expected to obtain a personal sanction from him for the release of funds from India. His untimely death was a great upset in Srila Prabhupada's plan to purchase the building at 143 West 72nd Street. The realtor had shown him the building, and he had already mentally designed the interior for deity worship and distribution of prasadam. The money was to come from India, and the Prime Minister Shastri was to give personal sanction for the release of the funds. But suddenly that was all changed. January 14th, Prabhupada decided to write to the owner of the building, Mr. A.M. Hartman. He explained how his plans had been upset and he posed a new plan. Now, the Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri is suddenly dead, and I am greatly perplexed as there is now great difficulty for getting money from India. I am requesting you to allow me to use the place for the International Institution for God Consciousness, at least for some time. The house is lying vacant for so many days without any use, and I learned it that you are paying taxes, insurance, and other charges for the house, although you have no income from there. If you, however, allow this place for this public institution, you shall at least save the taxes and other charges which you're paying now for nothing. If I can start the institution immediately, certainly I shall be able to get sympathy locally, and in that case, I may not be required to get money from India. I'm also requesting that Your Honor become one of the directors of this public institution because you will give a place to start the institution. Mr. A.M. Hartman wasn't interested. On the same day he wrote Mr. Hartman, Prabhupada received a letter from Sri Padampad Singhaniam, the director of a very large JK organization in India. Prabhupada had written Sri Padampadji for financial support, and his reply gave him hope. Not only with Singhania families fabulously wealthy, but its members were devotees of Lord Krishna. My dear Swamiji, I have gone through your letter and I am very glad to note your idea of erecting a Sri Radha Krishna temple in New York. I think the proposal is a good one, but the following are the difficulties. First, we have got to send foreign exchange for building the temple, for which government sanction is required. Without the government sanction, no money can be sent abroad. If the government of India agrees, then one can think of erecting the temple in New York. Second, I doubt whether with this small amount of 7 lakh $110,000, a temple can be built in New York. I mean to carry out such I mean to carry out a nice construction with Indian type of architecture. To get a temple completed in Indian type of architecture, we have to send a man from India. These are the two main difficulties. Otherwise, your idea is very good. Srila Prabhupada and Mr. Singhania had a basic disagreement. A magnificent Indian temple in New York would cost many millions of dollars to construct. Prabhupada knew, of course, that if Pad Singhania wanted, he could provide millions of dollars. But then how would they get so much money out of India? Prabhupada therefore again suggested they spend only 7 lakhs. After purchasing the house, he wrote, we can build another story upon it with a temple dome, chakra, etc. Prabhupada had his own line of reasoning. Lord Dwarkadhish exhibited his opulence at Dwarka with 16,000 queens, and it is understood that he built a palace of each and every queen. And the palace were made with jewels and stones, so that there was no necessity for artificial light in the palaces. So your conception of building a temple of Lord Krishna is in opulence. But we are residents of Vrindavan, and Vrindavan had no palaces like your Dwarka. Vrindavan is full of forests and cows on the bank of Yamuna, and Lord Krishna in his childhood played the part of a cowherd boy without any royal opulences, as you people, the inhabitants of Dwarka, are accustomed. So when Dwarkawalas meet the Vrindavanwalas, there may be a via media. With Sri Padampad's Dwarka-like wealth and Srila Prabhupada's Vrindavan-like devotion, Lord Krishna, the Lord of both Vrindavan and Dwarka, could be properly worshipped. January 22nd. He received Bon Maharaj's reply. 2 weeks before, Prabhupada had written to his godbrother, the director of the Institution of Oriental Philosophy in Vrindavan, that he had found a place for a temple in New York and that he wanted to install the deities of Radha Krishna. In his reply, Bon Maharaj quoted price estimates for 40-inch brass deities of Radha Krishna. But he also warned that to begin deity worship would be a heavy responsibility. Srila Prabhupada responded, I think that after the temple has started, some men, even from America, may be available. As I see, they have at the Ramakrishna Mission, as well as in so many yoga societies. So I'm trying to open a temple here because Srila Prabhupada Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati wanted it. Prabhupada also requested Bon Maharaj's assistance in getting the government sanction to release sanction release of money. He felt Padam Pad Singhania would donate. He mentioned that he had carried on an extensive personal correspondence with the Vice President of India, Ms. Dr. Radhakrishnan, who was also known to Bon Maharaj. Tell him that it is not an ordinary temple of worship, but an international institution for God consciousness based on the Srimad Bhagavatam. January 22nd, while Srila Prabhupada prayed to receive Radha Krishna in New York, a snowstorm hit the city. That morning, Srila Prabhupada, who had perhaps never seen snow, woke and thought that someone had whitewashed the side of the building next door. Not until he went outside that he discovered it was snow. The temperature was 10 degrees. The city went into a state of emergency, but Prabhupada continued his daily walks. Now he had to walk through heavy snow, only a thin dhoti beneath his overcoat, his head covered with his Swami hat. The main roads were cleared, but many sidewalks were covered with snow. Along the strip of park dividing Broadway, the gusting winds piled snowbanks to shoulder heights and buried the benches. The Broadway kiosks, plastered with layers of posters and notices, were now plastered with additional layers of snow and ice. But despite the weather, New Yorkers still walk their dogs, the pets now wearing raincoats and mackinaws. Such pampering by American dog owners left Prabhupada with a feeling of surprised amusement. As he approached the West End Avenue, he found the doorman blowing whistles to signal taxis as usual, but also scattering salt to melt the ice and create a safe sidewalks in front of the buildings. In Riverside Park, the benches, pathways, and the trees were glazed with ice and gave off a shimmering reflection from the sky. In the news, Selective Service officials announced the first substantial increase in draft since the Korean War. A month-long peace ended with the US Air Force bombing North Vietnam. The New York transit strike ended after 3 weeks, and the transit labor leader died in jail of a heart attack. January 30th. The East Coast was hit by severe blizzards. 7 inches of snow fell on the city with winds up to 50 miles an hour. The city of New York offered warm rooms and meals for people living in tenements without heat. JFK Airport was closed, as were train lines and roadways into the city. For the first time within 8 days, a state of emergency was declared because of snow. As a lone individual, Srila Prabhupada could not do anything about the snow emergency or the international warfare. He saw these as mere symptoms of the age of Kali. Always there would be misery in the material world. But if we But if he could bring Radha Krishna to a building in New York, nothing was impossible for the Supreme Lord. Even in the midst of Kali Yuga, a golden age could appear and people could get relief. If Americans could take to Krishna consciousness, the whole world would follow. Seen through the eyes of the scripture, Srila Prabhupada pushed on through the blizzard and pursued a thin trail for support of his Krishna consciousness mission. February 4. He wrote again to Tirtha Maharaj, who had agreed to try for the government sanction if he had first received written confirmation from a responsible donor pledging the funds for a temple. Prabhupada informed him that the donor would be Sri Padampat Singhania, and he enclosed Mr. Singhania's favorable letter of the 14th. Prabhupada reminded his godbrother. Srila Prabhupada's Bhakti Siddhanta wanted such temples in foreign cities like New York, London, Tokyo, etc. And I had personal talks with him when I first met him at Ulta Danga in 1922. Now, here is a chance for me to carry out his transcendental order. I'm just seeking your favor and mercy in making this attempt successful. February 5th, discouragement came to the plans Srila Prabhupada had formed around the promise of support by Padampat Singhania. Dwarkawala wrote to express his dissatisfaction of the 72nd Street building. I'm afraid that I cannot agree with your suggestion that you should buy a small house and erect something on top of it. Unfortunately, such a kind of proposal will not suit me. The temple must be a small one, but it must be constructed properly. I quite agree that you cannot spend a lot of money at present, but within the amount that the government may sanction, you should build something according to the architecture of Indian temples. Then only we be able to create some impression on the American people. This is all I can write to you in this connection. I'm very grateful for your taking the trouble of writing me. Prabhupada did not take this letter as final. He maintained hope that Sri Padampat Singhania would still give money for the temple. If only the transfer of money could be arranged. He continued writing his godbrothers and other devotees, asking them to try to secure the government's sanction. He maintained his same aspirations, even though his sole prospective donor had rejected his scheme of a chakran dome atop a conventional two-story building. February 15, he moved from room 501 downstairs, 2 floors to a room all of his own. I have changed my room to room 307 in the same building. As above mentioned, for better air and light. It is on the roadside junction of two roads, the Columbus Avenue and the 72nd Street. According to Dr. Mishra, Prabhupada moved in order to have his own place independent of the Mishra Yoga Society. February 16, Prabhupada wrote to the proprietors of the Universal Book House of Bombay, giving some hints for selling his Srimad Bhagavatam in Bombay area. He explained that he was trying to establish a Radha Krishna temple and that a big industrialist of India had promised to pay for the cost. Since it seemed that he might stay in the United States for many more days, he wanted the book house to take increased charge of selling his books throughout India. They were his agent for selling his books in Maharashtra, but now he recommended that they take responsibility in all provinces and introduce his book in colleges and universities throughout India. He also requested that they credit his bank account there for the books sold so far. February 26th, Mr. A.P. Dharwadkar of the Universal Book House replied, I cannot give you very happy news on the progress of the sale of Srimad Bhagavatam. because the subject is religious and only a small section of society may personally be interested in the books. We tried to push them through some booksellers in Nagpur, Ahmedabad, Pune, etc., but regret to inform you that after some time these booksellers returned the books for want of response. As such, we are not only unenthusiastic to agree to your proposal of taking up sales for all India, but we are just thinking of requesting you to nominate some other people in your place to represent your sale program in Maharashtra. So far, they had sold only 6 sets of his books, for which they were about to transfer rupees 172 to his account. This was hardly encouraging to the author. Again, India was not interested. Even in the land of religion, religious subjects were only for a small section of society. March 4, another reverse. On February 8th, Srila Prabhupada had written to India's new Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, requesting her to sanction the release of money from India. A reply dated February 25, New Delhi, came from the Prime Minister's office official secretary, Mr. L.K. Gha. Dear Swamiji, the Prime Minister has seen your letter of February 8, 1966. She appreciates the spirit which prompted you to carry the spiritual message of Srimad Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam to other countries. Owing to the critical foreign exchange situation which the country is facing, it is greatly regretted that it will not be possible to assist you from here in your plan to set up a Radha Krishna temple. But Prabhupada had other hopes. After writing to the Prime Minister, he had written again to Tirth Maharaj asking him to request Dr. Radhakrishnan to persuade the government to sanction the release of funds. He waited for 1 month. He waited for 1 month, no answer. Apparently, his godbrothers felt little obligation towards preaching in America. He had written that he needed encouragement from them to continue in America because it was so expensive. He had explained that he was spending the equivalent of 1,000 rupees a month. As such, I'm counting every day to receive your favorable replies. But there was no reply. March 18th, he wrote again to Sri Pad Singhania, requesting him to send a man from India to supervise the work on the temple in New York, as Mr. Singhania had previously suggested. There is no record of any reply to this request. Prabhupada wrote again to Sumati Morarji requesting her to please send him a mridanga to accompany his chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra. He also requested her that in future, when he would send many men from India, she obliged by giving them free passage on this Scindia steamship lines. No reply. As his financial situation became more urgent and his hopes were more strained, his support from India withdrew in silence. His unanswered correspondence was itself a kind of message, loud and clear. We cannot help you. Although no one encouraged him, Srila Prabhupada trusted in the order of his spiritual master and the will of Krishna. The word from the Prime Minister regarding government sanction had been a definite no, but he had received another extension of his visa. Now his last hope was Sri Padampad Singhania. Prabhupada knew that he was so influential a man in India that if he wanted, he could send money. He was Prabhupada's final hope. April 2nd. Mr. Singhania did not reply personally. He had his secretary, Mr. Ashwara Iyer, write to Prabhupada. thoroughly discouraging his last hope for purchasing a building in New York. I regret to write that Sri Padampadji is not interested in the scheme of a building a Radha Krishna temple in New York at present. In regard to the inquiry contained in the last paragraph of your letter, Mr. Padampadji duly received your books of Srimad Bhagavatam from your Delhi office. Yours faithfully. Seeing him from a distance, a tiny figure walking Manhattan Street and avenues among many other tiny figures, a foreigner whose visa had almost run out, we come upon only the external appearance of Srila Prabhupada. These days of struggle were real enough and very difficult, but his transcendental consciousness was always predominant. He was not living in Manhattan consciousness, but was absorbed in dependence upon Krishna. Just as when on the Jaladuta he had suffered his heart attack, his reading of Chaitanya Charitamrita had supplied him the nectarian of health. He had already succeeded. Certainly, he wanted to provide Radha Krishna a temple in New York, but his success was that he was remembering Krishna even in New York City in the winter of 1965-66, whether the world recognized him or not. Not a day went by when he did not work on Krishna's book, Srimad Bhagavatam. And not a day went by when he did not offer food to Krishna and speak on Krishna philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. Lord Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, "For one who sees me everywhere and sees everything in me, I am never lost to him and he is never lost to me." And Krishna assures his pure devotees that my devotee will never be vanquished. There was never any doubt about this for Srila Prabhupada. The only question was whether the Americans would take notice of the pure devotee in their mindset, in their midst. At this point, it seemed that no one was going to take him seriously. Chapter 16, Free to Teach. Here I'm now sitting in New York, the world's greatest city, such a magnificent city, but my heart is always hankering after that Vrindavan. I shall be very happy to return to my Vrindavan, that sacred place. But then, why are you here? Now, because it is my duty. I have brought some message for you people, because I have been ordered by my superior, my spiritual master. Whatever you have learned, you should go to the Western countries and you must distribute this knowledge. So, in spite of all my difficulties, all my inconveniences, I'm here because I'm obligated by duty. From a lecture by Srila Prabhupada. Room 307 was never meant for use as a residence or ashram or lecture hall. It was only a small, narrow office without furniture or a telephone. Its door held a large pane of frosted glass, the kind common in old offices. Above the door was a glass paned transom. Prabhupada placed his blankets on the floor before his metal footlocker, which now became a makeshift desk where he wrote. He slept on the floor. There were no facilities here for cooking or even for bathing. So daily he had to walk to Dr. Mishra's apartment. When he had lived in room 501 at Dr. Mishra's yoga ashram, Dr. Mishra had financed his needs. But now Prabhupada was on his own, and whatever he could raise by selling his books, he would have to use for his daily maintenance and for the monthly rent of $72. He noted that for a little powdered chili, the West End's superette charged 25 cents, 10 times what he would pay in India. He had no guaranteed income, his expenses had increased, and his physical comforts had reduced. But at least he had his own place. Now he was free to preach as he liked. He had come to America to speak about Krishna, and even from the beginning, he had found the opportunity to do so, whether at an informal get together at the Agarwal's living room or before a formal gathering at the Butler Lions Club. Dr. Norman Brown's Sanskrit class, Dr. Mishra's Yoga Society, or the Tagore Society. But he did not attach much importance to lecturing where people who gathered would hear only once. This was the main reason he wanted his own building in New York, so that people could come regularly, chant Hare Krishna, take prasadam in his company, and hear him speak from Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. Moving out of the yoga studio to a small office downstairs gave Prabhupada what he was looking for, his own place, but not even euphemistically could that place be called a temple. His name was on the door. Anyone seeing him there could find him, but who would come there? By its opulence and beauty, a temple is supposed to attract people to Krishna. But the room 307 was just the opposite. It was bare poverty. Even a person interested in spiritual topics would find it uncomfortable to sit on the rugless floor of a room shaped like a narrow railroad car. One of Dr. Mishra's students had donated a reel to reel tape recorder, and Prabhupada recorded some of his solitary bhajans, which he sang to his own accompaniment of hand cymbals. He also recorded a long philosophical essay, Introduction to Gita Upanishad. Even if no one attends, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had told him, you can go on chanting to the four walls. But since he was now free to speak his message in the new situation God had provided, he decided to lecture 3 evenings a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, to whoever would come. His first audiences consisted mainly of people who had learned about him and met him at Dr. Mishra's yoga studio. And despite the poverty of his room, the meetings became a source of new life for him. March 18. He expressed his optimism in a letter to Sumati Morarji. I'm very much encouraged when you wrote to me to say, I feel that you should stay there until you fully recover from your illness and return only after you have completed your mission. I think these lines dictated by you are the words of Lord Balkrishna expressed through your goodness. You will be pleased to know that I have improved my health back to normal and my missionary work is nicely progressing. I hope my project to start a temple of Sri Radhakrishna will also be realized by the grace of Lord. Since I came to New York from Butler, Pennsylvania, I have rented the above room at $70 per month, and I'm delivering the lectures of the Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, accompanied by Sankirtan, and the American ladies and gentlemen come to hear me. You will be surprised to know that they do not understand the language of Sankirtan, yet they hear with attention. The movement which I have started here is completely new to them because the Americans are generally acquainted with the Indian yoga gymnastics as performed by some Indian yogis here. They have never heard of bhakti, cult of the science of Krishna before, and still they are hearing. This is a great success for me. Outside the closed windows of room 307, the late winter night has fallen. Prabhupada's words are punctuated with the muted sounds of car horns and occasional sirens from the city, from the streets, and sometimes by the startling chords of a lonely foghorn of the Hudson, on the Hudson. Although bare, the room is warm. Prabhupada is speaking on the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Now Arjuna is perplexed. He is perplexed about whether to fight or not to fight. After seeing in front of him his relatives with whom he was to fight, he was perplexed, and there was some argument with Krishna. Now, here is the point: Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Prabhupada's voice is earnest, persuading. Sometimes his speech becomes high pitched and breaks with urgency. His cultured British diction hears a heavy Bengali accent, bears a heavy Bengali accent. Suddenly he pauses in his lecture and addresses someone in the room. Prabhupada, what is that? Man, what? Prabhupada, what is this book? Man, well, this is the translation of the Bhagavad Gita. Prabhupada is obviously displeased that while he is speaking, someone is looking through a book. This is hardly like the respect offered to a learned speaker described in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada, well, no, you can hear me. Man, I am hearing. Prabhupada, yes, don't turn your attention, just hear me. He is taking the role of a teacher, correcting his student. Of course, there is no compelling reason why any of his casual guests should feel obliged to obey him. He simply begs for their attention and yet demands it, just hear me, as he attempts to convince them of Krishna consciousness. You have heard that one must accept the spiritual master after carefully examination, just as one selects a bride or a bridegroom after careful examination. In India, they are very careful because the marriage of boys and girls take place under the guidance of the parents. So the parents very carefully see to it. Similarly, one has to accept the spiritual master. It is necessary. According to Vedic injunctions, everyone should have a spiritual master. Perhaps you have seen a sacred thread. You have got a sacred thread, Mr. Cohen. You have seen sacred thread. Prabhupada pauses. His audience has not noted the thin white cord he wears beneath his shirt across the upper part of his body. For thousands of years, Brahmanas in India have worn such threads placed diagonally across the torso, looped over the left shoulder, down to the right waist. A Brahmana holds his thread in his right hand while chanting the sacred Gayatri mantra 3 times a day. But this is all strange indeed to Americans. Prabhupada himself is exotic to them. His grey chadar wrapped around his shoulders, he sits crossed legs, erect on a thin pillow, and he sits facing him on the other side of his trunk, which now serves as a desk and lectern. They are close together in the narrowness of the room. He is frail and small and foreign to them, yet somehow he completely assured in a way that nothing to do with being a foreigner in New York. Visitors sense his strong presence. Two white lines of clay run neatly vertical on his forehead. His pale peach cloth are gathered in loose folds around his body. He pauses only a few seconds to inquire whether they had seen a sacred thread.
That sacred thread is a sign that a person has a spiritual master. Here, of course, there is no such distinction. But according to the Hindu system, a married girl also has some sign so that people can understand that this girl is married. She wears a red mark so that others may know that she is married. And according to the division in the hair, what is this line called? Man, part. Prabhupada, man, part. Prabhupada, what is the spelling? Man, P-A-R-T. Prabhupada, part. This parting also has some meaning. They know English and he knows the Gita, but he knows a good deal of English, whereas they know practically nothing of the Gita, which he has to spoon feed to them. But occasionally he asks their help in English vocabulary. When the part is in the middle, then the girl has a husband and she is coming from a respectable family. And if the part is here, then she is a prostitute. With a slight gesture, he raises his hand toward, but never really reaching his head. Yet somehow the half gesture clearly indicates a part on the side of the head. And then again, when a girl is well dressed, it should be understood that she has a husband at home. And when she is not well dressed, it is to be understood that her husband is away from home. You see, and a widow's dress, there are so many symptoms. So similarly, the sacred thread is a sign that a person has accepted a spiritual master, just as the red mark symbolizes that a girl has a husband. Although his audience may be momentarily enamored by what appears to be a description of Indian social customs, a careful listener can grasp the greater context of Prabhupada's speech. Everyone must accept a spiritual master. It's a heavy topic for a casual audience. What is the need of taking a spiritual master? Isn't this just for India? But he says everyone should have a spiritual master. What is a spiritual master anyway? Maybe he means that accepting a spiritual master is just another cultural item from Hinduism, like the thread or the part in a woman's hair or the widow's dress. The audience can easily regard his discussion as a kind of cultural exposition, just as one comfortably watches a film about the living habits of people in a foreign land, although one has no intention of adopting these habits as one's own. The Swami is wearing one of those threads on his body, but that's for Hindus, and it doesn't mean that Americans should wear them. But these Hindu beliefs are interesting. Actually, Prabhupada has no motive but to present the absolute truth as he has heard it in disciplic succession. But if anyone in that railroad's car-shaped room were to ask himself, should I surrender to a spiritual master? He would be confronted by the existential presence of a genuine guru. One is free if one is free to regard his talks as one likes. In every step of one's life, the spiritual master guides. Now, to give such guidance, a spiritual master should also be a very perfect man. Otherwise, how can he guide? Now, here Arjuna knows that Sri Krishna is the perfect person. So, therefore, he is accepting him. Shishyasteham shadhi mam tuam prapannam. Sanskrit. No one knows a word of it. But there is never any question for Srila Prabhupada. Even if they don't understand it, the transcendental sound of Shastra will purify them. It is his authority and he cannot omit it. And even at first impression, if it presents an air of scholarly authority, the original, though foreign, words of the sages. I am just surrendering unto you, and you accept me as your disciple. Arjuna says, friendly talks cannot make a solution to perplexity. Friendly talks may be going on for years together, but no solution. So here, Arjuna accepts Krishna as a spiritual master. This means that whatever Krishna will dictate, he has to accept. One cannot deny the order of the spiritual master. Therefore, one has to select a spiritual master by whose orders one will not commit a mistake. Suppose you accept the wrong person as spiritual master and he guides you wrongly, then your whole life is spoiled. So one has to accept a spiritual master whose guidance will make one's life perfect. That is a relationship between spiritual master and disciple. It is not a formality. It is a great responsibility, both for the disciple and for the spiritual master. And yes, student, if the disciple is in ignorance before Prabhupada, yes, Prabhupada acknowledges a serious question. It is for answering questions like this from disciples in ignorance that he has left retirement in India and come to America. Student, how does he know which master to choose? Because he doesn't have the knowledge to make a wise decision. Prabhupada. Yes, so the first thing is that one should be searching after a spiritual master, just as you search after some school. You must at least have some preliminary knowledge of what a school is. You can't search for a school and go to a cloth shop. If you are so ignorant that you do not know what is a school and what is a cloth shop, then it is very difficult for you. You must know at least what a school is. So that knowledge is like this. Tat vijnanartham sagurum evapi gachet samitpani shrotriyam brahmadishtam. According to this verse, the spiritual master is required for a person who is inquisitive about transcendental knowledge. There's another verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Tasmat Gurum Prapadyeta Jnasu Shreya Uttamam. One should search after a spiritual master if one is inquisitive about transcendental subject matters. Unless one is at least conversant with preliminary knowledge of transcendental matters, how can he inquire from the spiritual master? His questions seem satisfied. The lecture is not a prepared speech on a specific subject. Though grave and thorough in scholarship, it ranges over several philosophical points. Yet he never pauses, groping for words. He knows exactly what he wants to say, and it is only a question of how much his audience can take. But sometimes his mood is light, and he commiserates with his fellow New Yorkers, chuckling about the difficulties they share. Suppose there is a heavy snowfall, the whole New York City is flooded with snow, and you are all put into inconvenience. That is a sort of suffering, but you have no control over it. Sometimes he praises Dr. Mishra's students for having learned so nicely from their teacher. Now, what Dr. Mishra is teaching is very nice. He is teaching that, first of all, you must know who am I. That is very good. But that who am I can be known from Bhagavad Gita also. I am not this body. And sometimes a guest suddenly speaks out with an irrelevant question and the Swami patiently tries to consider it. Yet behind his tolerance, Prabhupada's mood is always one of urgency. Sometimes he talks quickly and one senses his desire to establish Krishna consciousness in the West as soon as possible. He has no followers, only a few books, no temples, and he openly states that he is racing against time. I am an old man. I could leave at any time. So, behind the formal delivery of Krishna conscious philosophy is an anxiety, an almost desperate desire to convince at least one soul to take up Krishna consciousness immediately. Now, the constrained situation of Butler and the Ananda Ashram and Dr. Mishra are behind him. He is free to speak about the absolute truth in full. Throughout his life, he has prepared for this, yet he is still discovering the best ways to present Krishna, exploring his Western guidance, testing their reactions. We should always remember that he is God. He is all powerful. In strength, no one could conquer him. In beauty, as far as beauty is concerned, when he was on the battlefield, have any of you seen a picture of Krishna? Have you seen? Have any of you ever seen Krishna? Oh no. Prabhupada's voice fades as he pauses, looking out at his audience. No one has ever seen Krishna. None of them have the slightest previous knowledge of Lord Krishna. In India, hundreds of millions worship Lord Krishna daily as the eternal form of all beauty and truth and view his graceful form in sculpture, painting, and dance. His philosophical teachings in Bhagavad Gita are all famous, and Prabhupada is his intimate emissary. Yet the ladies and gentlemen in room 307 look back at the Swami blankly. Prabhupada is discussing the real meaning of going to a sacred place in India. One should go to a sacred place in order to find some intelligent scholar in spiritual knowledge living there and make association with him. Just like my residence is at Vrindavana. So at Vrindavana, there are many big scholars and saintly persons living. So one should go to such holy places, not simply to take bath in the water, but one must be intelligent enough to find some spiritually advanced men living there and take instruction from him and be benefited by that. If a man has attachment for going to a place of pilgrimage to take a bath, but has no attraction for hearing from learned people there, he is considered to be an ass. He laughs. Sa eva go kharaha. Go means cow and khara means ass. So the whole civilization is moving like a civilization of cows and asses. Everyone is identifying with the body. Yes, you want to speak? Woman. In the places known as secret places, Prabhupada, sacred, yes, woman. Is it sacred places? Prabhupada, yes. Isn't it also a fact that there is more magnetism because of the meeting of saints and more advanced people? Prabhupada, oh yes, certainly, certainly. Therefore, the place itself has got some magnetism. Woman, yes, and when? Prabhupada, just like at Vrindavana, that is practical. Here I am now sitting in New York, the world's greatest city, such a magnificent city, but my heart is always hankering after that Vrindavana. Woman, yes, laughs. Prabhupada, yes, I am not happy here. Woman, yes, I know. Prabhupada, I shall be very happy to return to my Vrindavana, that sacred place. But then, why are you here? Now, because it is my duty. I have brought some message for you people, because I have been ordered by my superior, my spiritual master. Whatever you have learned, you should go to the Western countries and you must distribute this knowledge. So, in spite of all my difficulties, all my inconveniences, I am here because I am obligated by duty. If I go and sit down in Vrindavana, that will be good for my personal conveniences. I shall be very comfortable there, and I will have no anxiety, nothing of the sort. But I have taken all the risk in this old age because I am duty bound. I am duty bound. So I have to execute my duty despite all my inconveniences. An outsider opens the door and hesitantly glances inside. Prabhupada, stopping his lecture. Yes, yes, come in. You can come here. Robert Nelson was like a slow, simple country boy with a homespun manner, even though he had grown up in New York City. He was 20 years old. He wasn't part of the growing hippie movement. He didn't take marijuana or other drugs, and he didn't socialize much. He was a loner. He had gotten some technical education at Staten Island Community College and had tried his hand at the record manufacturing business, but without much success. He was interested in God and would attend various spiritual meetings around the city. So one night he wandered into the Yoga Society to hear Dr. Mishra's lecture, and there he saw Prabhupada for the first time. Robert. Swami was sitting cross-legged on a bench. There was a meeting and Dr. Mishra was standing up before a group of people. There were about 50 people coming there, and he talked on I am consciousness. Dr. Mishra talked and then gave Swami a grand introduction with a big smile. Swamiji is here, he said, and he swings around and waves his hand for a big introduction. It was beautiful. This was after Dr. Mishra spoke for about an hour. The Swami didn't speak, he sang a song. Afterward, I went up to him. He had a big smile. And he said that he likes young people to take to Krishna consciousness. He was very serious about it. He wanted all young people. So I thought that was very nice. It made sense. So I wanted to help. We stood there talking for about an hour. Mishra had a library in the back, and we looked at certain books. Arjuna, Krishna, chariots, and things. And then we walked around. We looked at some of the pictures of Swamis on the wall. By that time, it was getting very late, and Prabhupada said, come back the next day at 10 to his office downstairs. The next day, when Robert Nelson went to room 307, Prabhupada invited him in. The room was clearly not intended intended to serve as a living quarters. There was no toilet, shower, chair, bed, or telephone. The walls were painted a dark, dismal color. Prabhupada showed Robert the 3-volume set of Srimad Bhagavatam, which Robert purchased for 1650. Then Prabhupada handed him a small piece of paper with the Hare Krishna mantra printed on it. Robert, while Swamiji was handing it to me, he had this big smile on his face like he was handing me the world. We spent the whole day together. At one point, he said, we are going to take a sleep. So he lay down there by his little desk. And so I said, I am tired too. So I lay down at the other end of the room and we rested. I just lay on the floor. It was the only place to do it. But he didn't rest that long, an hour and a half, I think. And we spent the rest of the day together. He was talking about Lord Chaitanya and the Lord's pastimes, and he showed me a small picture of Lord Chaitanya. Then he started talking about the devotees of Lord Chaitanya, Nityananda and Advaita. He had a picture of the 5 of them and a picture of his spiritual master. He said some things in Sanskrit and then he translated. It wasn't much of a room, though. You'd really be disappointed if you saw it. Robert Nelson couldn't give Prabhupada the kind of assistance he needed. Lord Chaitanya states that a person has at his command 4 assets: his life, money, intelligence, and words, at least one of which he should give to the service of God. Robert Nelson did not seem able to give his whole life to Krishna consciousness, and as for money, he had very little. His intelligence was also limited, and he spoke unimpressively. Nor did he have a wide range of friends or contacts among whom to speak. But he was affectionate toward the Swami, and out of the 8 million people in the city, he was practically the only one who showed personal interest in him and offered to help. From his experience in the record business, Mr. Robert, as Swamiji called him, developed a scheme to produce a record of Swamiji singing. People were always putting out albums with almost anything on them, he explained, and they would always make money, or at least break even. So it would be almost impossible to lose money. It was a way he thought he could help make the Swami known, and he tried to convince Prabhupada of the idea. And Prabhupada didn't discourage Mr. Robert, who seemed eager to render this service. Robert, me and the Swami went around to this record company on 46th Street. We went there and I started talking, and the man was all business. He was all business and mean. They go together. So we went in there with a tape and we tried talking to the man. Swami was talking, but the man said he couldn't put the tape out. I think he listened to the tape, but he wouldn't put it out. So we felt discouraged, but he didn't say much about it. Prabhupada had been in business in India, and he wasn't about to think that he could suddenly take up business in a foreign country on the advice of a young boy in New York City. Besides, he had come not to do business but to preach. Robert, however, was enthusiastically offering service. Perhaps he wouldn't become a regular brahmachari student, but he had a desire to serve Krishna. For Prabhupada to refuse him would be perhaps to turn away an interested Western young person. Prabhupada had come to speak about Krishna, to present the chanting, and if Mr. Robert wanted to help by arranging for an American record album, then that was welcome. Mr. Robert and the Swami made an odd combination. Prabhupada was elderly and dignified, a deep scholar of the Bhagavatam and the Sanskrit language, whereas Robert Nelson was artless, even in Western culture, and inept in worldly ways. Together they would walk, the Swami wearing his winter coat with its imitation fur collar, his Indian dhoti and white pointed shoes. Mr. Robert wearing old khaki pants and an old coat. Prabhupada walked with rapid, determined strides, outpacing the lumbering, rambling, heavy-set boy who had befriended him. Mr. Robert was supposed to help Prabhupada in making presentations to businessmen and real estate men, yet he himself was hardly a slick fellow. He was innocent. Robert, once we went over to this big office building on 42nd Street and we went in there. The rent was thousands of dollars for a whole floor. So I was standing there talking to the man, but I didn't understand how all this money would come. The Swami wanted a big place, and I didn't know what to tell the man. Prabhupada wanted a big place, and a big place meant a big price. He had no money, and Robert Nelson had only his unemployment checks. Still, Prabhupada was interested. If he were to find a building, that would be a great step in his mission. And this was also another way of engaging Mr. Robert. Besides, Krishna might do anything, give anything, or work in any way, ordinary or miraculous. So Prabhupada had his reasoning, and Mr. Robert had his. Robert, the building was between 6th and Broadway on 42nd Street, some place to open Krishna's temple. We went in and up to the second floor and saw the renting agent, and then we left. I think it was 5,000 a month or 10,000 a month. We got to a certain point and the money was too much, and then we left. When we brought up the prices, I figured we had better not. We had to stop. On another occasion, Robert Nelson took Prabhupada by bus to the Hotel Columbia at 70 West 46th Street. The hotel had a suite that Prabhupada looked at for possible use as a temple, but again it was very expensive and there was no money. Sometimes Robert would make purchases for Prabhupada with the money from his unemployment checks. Once he bought orange-colored t-shirts. Once he went to Woolworths and bought kitchen pots and pans and some picture frames for Prabhupada's pictures of Lord Chaitanya and his spiritual master. Robert, one time I wanted to know how to make chapati cakes, so Swami says, $100, please, for the recipe. $100, please. So I went and got some money, but I couldn't get $100. But he showed me anyway. He taught me to cook and would always repeat, wash hands, and you should only eat with your right hand. And whoever met the Swami was almost always impressed. They would start smiling back to him, and sometimes they would say funny things to each other that were nice. The Swami's English was very technical always. I mean, he had a big vocabulary. But sometimes people had a little trouble understanding him, and you had to help sometimes. The Paradox at 64 East 7th Street on the Lower East Side was a restaurant dedicated to the philosophy of Georges Oshawa and the macrobiotic diet. It was a storefront below street level and with small dining tables placed around the candlelit room. The food was inexpensive and well reputed. Tea was served free, as much as you liked. More than just a restaurant, the Paradox was a center for spiritual and cultural interests, a meeting place reminiscent of the cafes of Greenwich Village or Paris in the 1920s. A person could spend the whole day at the Paradox without buying anything, and no one would complain. The crowd at the Paradox was a mystical congregation, interested in teachings from the East. When news of the new Swami uptown at Dr. Mishra's reached the Paradox, the word spread quickly. Harvey Cohen and Bill Epstein were friends. Harvey was a freelance artist and Bill worked at the Paradox. After Harvey had been to Prabhupada's place at Dr. Mishra's yoga studio a few times, he came by the Paradox and began to describe all about the new Swami to Bill and other friends. Bill, I was working at the Paradox one night when Harvey came to me and said, I went to visit Mishra and there's a new Swami there and he's really fantastic. Well, I was involved in macrobiotics and Buddhism, so at first I couldn't care less. But Harvey was a winning and warm personality and he seemed interested in this. He said, why don't you come uptown? I would like you to see this. So I went to one of the lectures on 72nd Street. I walked in there and I could feel a certain presence from the Swami. He had a certain very concentrated, intense appearance. He looked pale and kind of weak. I guess he had just come here and he had been through a lot of things. He was sitting there chanting on his beads, which he carried in a little bead bag. One of Dr. Mishra's students was talking, and he finally got around to introducing the Swami. He said, we are the moons to the Swami's sun. He introduced him in that way. The Swami got up and talked. I didn't know what to think about it. At that time, the only steps I had taken in regard to Indian teaching were through Ramakrishna. But this was the first time, to my knowledge, that Bhakti religion had come to America. Bill Epstein, quiet in contrast to Robert Nelson, was a dashing romantic person with long, wavy dark hair and a beard. He was good-looking and effervescent and took upon himself a role of informing people at the restaurant of the city's spiritual news. Once he became interested in the new Swami, he made the Swami an ongoing topic of conversation at the restaurant. Bill, I went in the back and I asked Richard, the manager, I'm going to take some food to the Swami. You don't mind, do you? He said, no, take anything you want. So I took some brown rice and other stuff and I brought it up there. I went upstairs and I knocked on the door and there was no answer. I knocked again and I saw that the light was on because it had a glass panel. And finally he answered. I was really scared because I had never really accepted any teacher. He said, come in, sit down. We started talking and he said to me, the first thing that people do when they meet is to show each other love. They exchange names, they exchange something to eat. So he gave me a slice of apple and he showed me the tape recorder he had, probably for recording his chants. Then he said, have you ever chanted? I said, no, I haven't chanted before. So he played a chant and then he spoke to me some more. He said, you must come back. I said, well, if I come back, I'll bring you some more food. James Green, a 30-year-old carpentry teacher at Cooper Union, was delving into Eastern philosophy. He lived on the same block as the Paradox and began hearing about the Swami from Harvey Cohen and Will Epstein while regularly taking his evening meal at the restaurant. James, it was really Harvey and Bill who got things going. I remember one evening at Mishra's in which Swamiji was only a presence but did not speak. Mishra's students seemed more into the bodily aspect of yoga. This seemed to be one of Swamiji's complaints. His room on 72nd Street was quite small. He was living in a fairly narrow room with a door on the one end. Swamiji would set himself up along one side, and we were rather closely packed. It may have been no more than 8 feet wide, and it was rather dim. He sat on his thin mattress, and then we sat on the floor. We wouldn't chant, we would just come and he would lecture. There was no direction other than the lecture on the Bhagavad Gita. I had read a lot of literature, and in my own shy way, I was looking for a master, I think. I have no aggression in me or go-getting quality. I was really just a listener, and this seemed right, hearing the Bhagavad Gita. So I kept coming. It just seemed as if things would grow from there. More and more people began coming. Then it got crowded, and he had to find another place.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. The new group from the Paradox was young and hip, in contrast to the older, more conservative uptown people who had been attending Prabhupada's classes. In those days, it was still unusual to see a person with long hair and a beard, and when such people started coming to the Swami's meetings on the west side, some of the older people were alarmed. As one of them noted, Swami Bhaktivedanta began to pick up another kind of people. He picked them up at the Bowery or some attics. And they came with funny hats and gray blankets wrapped around themselves, and they startled me. David Allen, a 21-year-old seeker who came up from the Paradox, had just moved to the city, optimistically attracted by what he had read about experimentation with drugs. He saw the old group as a kind of fuss-budgety group of older women on the west side, listening to the Swami's lectures. David, we weren't known as hippies then, but it was strange for the people who had originally been attracted to him. It was different for them to relate to this new group. I think most of the teachers from India up to that time had older followers, and sometimes wealthy widows would provide a source of income. But Swamiji changed right away to the younger, poorer group of people. The next thing that happened was that Bill Epstein and others began talking about how it would be better for the Swami to come downtown to the Lower East Side. Things were really happening down there, and somehow they weren't happening uptown. People downtown really needed him. Downtown was right and it was ripe. There was life down there. There was a lot of energy going around. Chapter 17 on the Bowery. I couldn't understand the difference between friends and enemies. My friend was shocked to hear that I was moving to the Bowery. But although I passed through many dangers, I never thought that this is danger. Everywhere I thought this is my home. Srila Prabhupada in conversation. April 1966. Someone broke into room 307 while Srila Prabhupada was out and stole his typewriter and tape recorder. When Prabhupada returned to the building, the janitor informed him of the theft. An unknown burglar had broken that transom glass, climbed through, taken the valuables, and escaped. As Prabhupada listened, he became convinced that the janitor himself was the culprit. Of course, he couldn't prove it, so he accepted the loss with disappointment. Some friends offered replacements for his old typewriter and tape recorder. In a letter to India, he described the theft as a loss of more than 1,000 rupees, $157. It is understood that such crime as has been committed in my room is very common in New York. This is the way of material nature. American people have everything in ample, and the worker gets about rupees 100 as daily wages. And still there are thieves for want of character. The social condition is not very good. Prabhupada had told Joseph Forster, the Scindia ticket agent, that he would be returning to India in a couple of months. That was 7 months ago. Now, for the first time since his arrival, Prabhupada had returned to the Scindia ticket office in Brooklyn. He talked about the theft to Mr. Forster, who responded with "Welcome to the club," and told Prabhupada about the recent theft of his own automobile. Such things, he explained, were not unusual for New York City. He told Prabhupada of the dangers of the city and how to avoid thefts and muggings. Prabhupada listened, shaking his head. He told Mr. Forster that American young people were misguided and confused. He discussed his plans for returning to India and showed Mr. Forster one of his Bhagavatams. Prabhupada had lost his spirit for living in room 307. What would prevent the janitor from stealing again? Harvey Cohen and Bill Epstein had advised him to relocate downtown and had assured him of a more interested following among the young people there. It had been an attractive proposal and he began to reconsider it. Then Harvey offered Prabhupada his studio on the Bowery. Harvey had been working as a commercial artist for a Madison Avenue advertising firm when a recently acquired inheritance had spurred him to move into a loft on the Bowery to pursue his own career as a painter. But he was becoming disillusioned with New York. A group of acquaintances addicted to heroin had been coming around and taking advantage of his generosity, and his loft had recently been burglarized. He decided to leave the city and go to California. But before leaving, he offered his loft for Prabhupada to share with David Allen. David Allen had heard that Harvey Cohen was moving to San Francisco if he could sublet his AIR loft. Harvey hadn't known David very long, but on the night before Harvey was supposed to leave, he coincidentally met David 3 different times in 3 different places on the Lower East Side. Harvey took this as a sign that he should rent the loft to David, but he specifically stipulated that the Swami should move in too. As Prabhupada was preparing to leave his 72nd Street address, an acquaintance, an electrician who worked in the building, came to warn him. The Bowery was no place for a gentleman, he protested. It was the most corrupt place in the world. The Prabhupada's things had been stolen from room 307, but moving to the Bowery was not the answer. Srila Prabhupada's new home, the Bowery, had a long history. In the early 1600s, when Manhattan was known as New Amsterdam and was controlled by the Dutch West India Company, Peter Minuit, the governor of New Netherlands, staked out a north-south road that was called the Bowery because a number of Boweries or farms lay on either side. It was a dusty country road lined with quaint Dutch cottages and bordered by the peach orchards growing in the estate of Peter Stuyvesant. It became part of the high road to Boston and was of strategic importance during the American Revolution as the only land entrance to New York City. In the early 1800s, the Bowery was predominated by German immigrants. Later in the century, it became predominantly Jewish and gradually it became the city's center of theatrical life. However, as the history of Lower Manhattan describes, after 1870 came the period of the Bowery's celebrated degeneration. Fake auction rooms, saloons specializing in 5-cent whiskey and knockout drops, sensational dive museums, filthy and rat-ridden stale beer dives, together with Charles M. Hoyt's song, the Bowery, I'll never go there anymore, fixed it forever in the nation's consciousness as a place of unspeakable corruption. The reaction of Prabhupada's electrician friend was not unusual. The Bowery is still known all over the world as Skid Row, a place of ruined and homeless alcoholics. Perhaps the uptown electrician had done business in the Bowery and had seen the derelicts sitting around passing a bottle or lying unconscious in the gutter, or staggering up to passerby and drunkenly bumping into them to ask for money. Most of Bowery's 7,000 or 8,000 homeless men slept in lodging houses that required them to vacate their rooms during the day. Having nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, they would loiter on the street, standing silently on the sidewalks, leaning against a wall or shuffling slowly along, alone or in groups. In cold weather, they would wear 2 coats and several suits of clothes at once and would sometimes warm themselves around a fire they would keep going in a city garbage can. At night, those without lodging slept on the sidewalks, doorsteps, and street corners, crawled into discarded boxes, or sprawled side by side next to the bars. Thefts were commonplace. A man's pockets might be searched 10 or 20 times while he slept. The rates of hospitalization and death in the Bowery were 5 times higher than the national average, and many of the homeless men bore marks of recent injuries or violence. Prabhupada's loft, 94 Bowery, was 6 blocks south of Houston Street. At Houston and Bowery, the derelicts converged in the heavy crosstown traffic. When cars stopped for the light, bums would come up and wash the windshields and ask for money. South of Houston, the first blocks held mostly restaurant supply stores, lamp stores, taverns, and luncheonettes. The buildings were of 3 and 4 stories, old, narrow, crowded tenements, their faces covered with heavy fire escapes. Traffic on the Bowery ran uptown and downtown. Cars parked on both sides of the street and the constant traffic passed tightly. During the business day, working people passed briskly among the slow-moving derelicts. Many of the store windows were covered with protective iron gates, but behind the gates, the store owners lit their varieties of lamps to attract prospective wholesale and retail customers. 94 Bowery was just 2 doors north of Hester Street. The corner was occupied by the spacious Half Moon Tavern, which was frequented mostly by neighborhood alcoholics. Above the tavern sat a 4-story Bowery flop house marked by a neon sign, Palma House, which was covered by a protective metal cage and hung from the 2nd floor on large chains. The hotel's entrance at 92 Bowery, which had no lobby but only a desolate hallway covered with dirty white tiles, was no more than 6 feet from the entrance to 94. 94 Bowery was a narrow 4-story building. It had long ago been painted grey and wore the usual facing of a massive black fire escape. A well-worn black double door, its glass panels reinforced with chicken wire, opened onto the street. The sign above the door read AIR 3rd and 4th, indicating that artists in residence occupied those floors. The first floor of the next building, north, 96 Bowery, was used for storage. and its front entrance was covered with a rusty iron gate. At 98 Bowery was another tavern, Harrods, smaller and dingier than the Half Moon. Thus, the block consisted of 2 saloons, a flophouse, and 2 buildings with lofts. In the 1960s, loft living was just beginning in that area of New York City. The city had given permission for painters, musicians, sculptors, and other artists who required more space than available in most apartments to live in buildings that had been constructed as factories in the 19th century. After these abandoned factories had been fitted with fireproof doors, bathtubs, shower stalls, and heating, an artist could inexpensively use a large space. These were the AIR lofts. Harvey Cohen's loft on the top floor of 94 Bowery was an open space almost 100 feet long from east to west and 25 feet wide. It received a good amount of sunlight on the east, the Bowery side, and it also had windows at the west end as well as a skylight. The exposed rafters of the ceiling were 12 feet above the floor. Harvey Cohen had used the loft as an art studio, and racks for paintings still lined the walls. A kitchen and shower were partitioned off in the northwest corner, and a room divider stood about 15 feet from the Bowery side windows. This divider did not run from wall to wall, but was open at both ends, and it was several feet short of the ceiling. It was behind this partition that Prabhupada had his personal living area. A bed and a few chairs stood near the window, and Prabhupada's typewriter sat on his metal trunk next to the small table that held his stacks of Bhagavatam manuscripts. His dhotis hung drying on a clothesline. On the other side of the partition was a dais, about 10 feet wide and 5 feet deep, on which Prabhupada sat during his kirtanas and lectures. The dais faced west toward the loft's large open space, open, that is, except for a couple of rugs and an old-fashioned solid wood table, and on an easel, Harvey's painting of Lord Chaitanya dancing with his associates. The loft was a 4-flight walk-up, and the only entrance, usually heavily bolted, was a door in the rear, at the west end. From the outside, this door opened into a hallway lit only by a red exit light over the door. The hallway led to the right a few steps and then into the open area. If a guest entered during a kirtana or a lecture, he would see the Swami about 30 feet from the entrance, seated on his dais. On other evenings, the whole loft would be dark, but for the glow of the red exit light in the little hallway and a soft illumination radiating from the other side of the partition where Prabhupada was working. Prabhupada lived on the Bowery sitting under a small light, while hundreds of derelicts also sat under hundreds of naked lights on the same city block. He had no more fixed income than the derelicts, nor any greater security of a fixed residence, yet his consciousness was different. He was translating Srimad Bhagavatam into English, speaking to the world through his Bhaktivedanta purports. His duty, whether on the 14th floor of a Riverside Drive apartment building or in a corner of a Bowery loft, was to establish Krishna consciousness as the prime necessity for all humanity. He went on with his translating and with his constant vision of a Krishna temple in New York City. Because his consciousness was absorbed in Krishna's universal mission, he did not depend on his surroundings for shelter. Home for him was not a matter of bricks and wood, but of taking shelter of Krishna in every circumstance. As Prabhupada had said to his friends uptown, everywhere is my home, whereas without Krishna's shelter, the whole world would be a desolate place. Often he would refer to a scriptural statement that people live in 3 different modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. Life in the forest is in the mode of goodness. Life in the city is in passion. And life in a degraded place like a liquor shop or brothel or the Bowery is in the mode of ignorance. But to live in a temple of Vishnu is to live in the spiritual world, Vaikuntha, which is transcendental to all 3 material modes. And this Bowery loft where Prabhupada was holding his meetings and performing kirtana was also transcendental. When he was behind the partition, working in his corner before the open pages of Srimad Bhagavatam, that room was as good as his room back at the Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavana. News of the Swami's move to the Bowery loft spread, mostly by word of mouth at the Paradox restaurant, and people began to come by in the evening to chant with him. The musical kirtanas were especially popular on the Bowery, since the Swami's new congregation consisted mostly of local musicians and artists who responded more to the transcendental music than to the philosophy. Every morning, he would hold a class on Srimad Bhagavatam, attended by David Allen, Robert Nelson, and another boy, and occasionally he would teach cooking to whoever was interested. He was usually available for personal talks with any inquiring visitors or with his new roommate. Although Prabhupada and David each had a designated living area in the large loft, the entire place soon became dominated by Prabhupada's preaching activities. Prabhupada and David got on well together, and at first Prabhupada considered David an aspiring disciple. April 27. He wrote to his friends in India, describing his relationship with David Allen. He was attending my class at 72nd Street along with others, and when I experienced this theft case in my room, he invited me to his residence. So I am with him and training him. He has good prospect because already he has given up all bad habits. In this country, illicit connection with women, smoking, drinking, and eating of meats are common affairs. Besides that, there are other bad habits like using only toilet paper and not bathing after evacuating, etc. But by my request, he has given up 90% of his old habits and he is chanting Mahamantra regularly. So I am giving him the chance and I think he is improving. Tomorrow I have arranged for some prasadam distribution and he has gone to purchase some things from the market. When David first came to the Bowery, he appeared like a clean-cut college student. He was 21, 6 feet tall, blue-eyed, handsome, and intelligent-looking. Most of his new friends in New York were older and considered him a kid. David's family lived in East Lansing, Michigan, and his mother was paying $100 monthly to sublease the loft. Although he did not have much experience, he had read that a new realm of mind expansion was available through psychedelic drugs, and he was heading fast into the hazardous world of LSD. His meeting with the Swami came at a time of radical change and profoundly affected his life. David, it was a really good relationship I had with the Swami, but I was overwhelmed by the tremendous energy of being that close to him. It spurred my consciousness very fast. Even my dreams at night would be so vivid of Krishna consciousness. I was often sleeping when the Swami was up. But because he was up late in the night working on his translations, that's possibly where a lot of the consciousness and dreams just flowed in because of that deep relationship. It also had to do with studying Sanskrit. There was a lot of immediate impact with the language. The language seemed to have such a strong mystical quality, the way he translated it word for word. Prabhupada's old friend from uptown, Robert Nelson, continued to visit him on the Bowery. He was impressed by Prabhupada's friendly relationship with David, who he saw was learning many new things from the Swami. Mr. Robert bought a small American-made hand organ similar to an Indian harmonium and donated it to David for chanting with Prabhupada. At 7 in the morning, Mr. Robert would come by and after Bhagavatam class, he would talk informally with Prabhupada, telling his ideas for making records and selling books. He wanted to continue helping the Swami. They would sit in chairs near the front window and Mr. Robert would listen while Prabhupada talked for hours about Krishna and Lord Chaitanya. New people began coming to see Prabhupada on the Bowery. Carl Jurgens, a 30-year-old black man from the Bronx, had attended Cornell University and was now independently studying Indian religion and Zen Buddhism. He had experimented with drugs as psychedelic tools, and he had an interest in the music and poetry of India. He was influential among his friends and tried to interest them in meditation. He had even been dabbling in Sanskrit. Carl, I had just finished reading a book called The Wonder That Was India. I had gotten the definition of a sannyasi and a brahmachari and so forth. There was a vivid description in that particular book of how you could see a sannyasi coming down the road with his saffron robe. It must have made more than just a superficial impression on me because it came to me this one chilly evening. I was going to visit Michael Grant, probably going to smoke some marijuana and sit around, maybe play some music. And I was coming down Hester Street. If you make a left on Bowery, you can go up to Mike's place on Grant Street. But it's funny that I chose to go that way because the shorter way would have been to go down Grant Street. But if I had gone that way, I would probably have missed Swamiji. So I decided to go down Hester and then make a left. All of a sudden, I saw in this dingy alcove a brilliant saffron robe. As I passed, I saw it was Swamiji knocking on the door, trying to gain entrance. There were two bums hunched up against the door. It was like a two-part door. One of them was sealed and the other was locked. The two bums were lying on either side of Swamiji. One of these men had actually expired, which often happened, and you had to call the police or health department to get them. I don't think I saw the men lying in the doorway until I walked up to Swamiji and asked him, "Are you a sannyasi?" And he answered, "Yes." We started this conversation about how he was starting a temple, and he mentioned Lord Chaitanya and the whole thing. He just came out with his flow of strange things to me right there in the street, but I knew what he was talking about somehow. I had the familiarity of having just read this book and delved into Indian religion. So I knew that this was a momentous occasion for me, and I wanted to help him. We banged on the door, and eventually we got into the loft. He invited me to come to a kirtana, and I came back later that night for my first kirtana. From that point on, it was a fairly regular thing, 3 times a week. At one point, Swamiji asked me to stay with him, and I stayed for about 2 weeks. It was perhaps because of Carl's interest in Sanskrit that Prabhupada began holding Sanskrit classes. Carl and David and a few others would spend hours learning Sanskrit under Prabhupada's guidance. Using a chalkboard he found in the loft, Prabhupada taught the alphabet, and his students wrote their exercises in notebooks. Prabhupada would look over their shoulders to see if they were writing correctly and would review their pronunciation. His students were learning not simply Sanskrit, but the instructions of Bhagavad Gita. Each day he would give them a verse to copy in the Sanskrit alphabet, Devanagari, transliterate into the Roman alphabet, and then translate word for word into English. But their interest in Sanskrit waned, and Prabhupada gradually gave up the daily classes to spend time working on his own translations of the Srimad Bhagavatam. His new friends may have regarded these lessons as Sanskrit classes, but actually they were bhakti classes. He had not come to America as the ambassador of Sanskrit. His Guru Maharaj had ordered him to teach Krishna consciousness. But since he had found in Carl and some of his friends a desire to investigate Sanskrit, he encouraged it. As a youth, Lord Chaitanya had also started a Sanskrit school with the real purpose of teaching love of Krishna. He would teach in such a way that every word meant Krishna. And when his students objected, he closed the school. Similarly, when Prabhupada found that his students' interest in Sanskrit was transitory, and since he himself had no mission on behalf of Sanskrit linguistics, he gave it up. By the standard of classical Vedic scholars, it takes 10 years for a boy to master Sanskrit grammar. And if one does not start until his late 20s or 30s, it is unusually too late. Certainly, none of Swamiji's students were thinking of entering a 10-year concentration in Sanskrit grammar. And even if they were, they would not realize spiritual truth simply by becoming grammarians. Prabhupada thought it better to utilize his own Sanskrit scholarship in translating the verses of Srimad Bhagavatam into English, following the Sanskrit commentaries of the previous authorities. Otherwise, the secrets of Krishna consciousness would remain locked away in the Sanskrit. Teaching Carl Jürgens Devanagari, Sandhi, verb conjugations, and noun declensions was not going to give the people of America transcendental Vedic knowledge. Better that he utilize his proficiency in Sanskrit for translating many volumes of the Bhagavatam into English for millions of potential readers. Carol Baker came from an immigrant Catholic background, and she immediately associated with Catholicism the Swami's presence as a spiritual authority and his devotional practices of chanting on beads and reciting from Sanskrit scriptures. Sometimes she would accompany Prabhupada to nearby Chinatown where he would purchase ingredients for his cooking. He would cook daily, and sometimes Carol and others would come by to learn the secrets of cooking for Lord Krishna. Carol. He used to cook with us in the kitchen, and he was always aware of everyone else's activities in addition to his own cooking. He knew exactly how things should be. He washed everything and made sure everyone did everything correctly. He was a teacher. We used to make chapatis by hand. By then, one day, he asked me to get him a rolling pin. I brought my rolling pin and he appropriated it. He put some men on rolling chapatis and supervised them very carefully. I made a chutney for him at home. He always accepted our gifts graciously, although I don't think he ever ate them. Perhaps he was worried we might put in something that wasn't allowed in his diet. He used to take things from me and put them in the cupboard. I don't know what he finally did with them, but I am sure he didn't throw them away. I never saw him eat anything that I had prepared, although he accepted everything. Prabhupada held his evening meetings on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, just as he had uptown. The loft was out of the way for most of his acquaintances, and it was on the Bowery. A cluster of sleeping derelicts regularly blocked the street level entrance, and visitors would find as many as half a dozen bumps to step over before climbing the 4 flights of stairs. But it was something new. You could go and sit with a group of hip people and watch the Swami lead Kirtana. The room was dimly lit, and Prabhupada would burn incense. Many casual visitors came and went. One of them, Gantha, had vivid impressions. Gantha. You walked right off the Bowery into a room filled with incense. It was quiet. Everyone was talking in hushed tones, not really talking at all. Swamiji was sitting in the front of the room and in meditation. There was a tremendous feeling of peace which I have never had before. I had happened to have studied for 2 years to become a minister and was into meditation, study, and prayer. But this was my first time to do anything Eastern or Hindu. There were lots of pillows around and mats on the floor for people to sit on. I don't think there were any pictures or statues, but it was just Swamiji, incense, and the mats, and obviously the respect of the people in the room for him. Before we went up, Carl was laughing and saying how Swami wanted everyone to use the hand symbols just correctly. I had never played the symbols before, but when it began, I just tried to follow Swamiji, who was doing it in a certain way. Things were building up, the sound was building up, but then someone was doing it wrong. And Swamiji just very, very calmly shook a finger at someone and they looked, and then everything stopped. He instructed this person from a distance, and this fellow got the right idea and they started up again. After a few minutes, the sound of the cymbals and the incense, we weren't in the Bowery any longer. We started chanting Hare Krishna. That was my first experience in chanting. I had never chanted before. There's nothing in Protestant religion that comes even close to that. Maybe Catholics with their Hail Marys, but it's not quite the same thing. It was relaxing and very interesting to be able to chant, and I found Swamiji very fascinating. The loft was more open than Prabhupada's previous place uptown, so there was less privacy. And here some of the visitors were skeptical and even challenging, but everyone found him confident and joyful. He seemed to have far-reaching plans and he had dedication. He knew what he wanted to do and was single-handedly carrying it out. It is not one man's job, he had said, but he went on doing all he could depending on Krishna for the results. David was beginning to help and more people were coming by to visit him. Almost all of Prabhupada's Bowery friends were musicians or friends of musicians. They were into music, drugs, women, and spiritual meditation. Because Prabhupada's presentation of the Hare Krishna mantra was both musical and meditative, they were automatically interested. Prabhupada stressed that all the Vedic mantras or hymns were sung. In fact, the words Bhagavad Gita meant the song of God. But the words of the Vedic hymns were incarnations of God in the form of transcendental sound. The musical accompaniment of hand cymbals, drums, and harmonium was just that, an accompaniment, and had no spiritual purpose independent of the chanting of the name of God. Prabhupada allowed any instrument to be used as long as it did not detract from the chanting. Carol. It was a very interracial music-oriented scene. There were a few professional musicians and a lot of people who enjoyed playing or just listening. Some people were painting in some of the lofts, and that's basically what was going on. We had memorable kirtanas. One time there was a beautiful ceremony. Some of us went over early to prepare for it. There must have been 100 people who came that day. For the Bowery crowd, sound was spirit and spirit was sound, in a merging of music and meditation. But for Prabhupada, music without the name of God wasn't meditation, it was sense gratification, or at most a kind of stylized, impersonal meditation. But he was glad to see the musicians coming to play along in his kirtanas, to hear him and to chant responsively. Some, having stayed up all night playing somewhere on their instruments, would come by in the morning and sing with the Swami. He did not dissuade them from their focus on sound, rather, he gave them sound. In the Vedas, sound is said to be the first element of material creation. The source of sound is God, and God is eternally a person. Prabhupada's emphasis was on getting people to chant God's personal transcendental name, whether they took it as jazz, folk music, rock, or Indian meditation made no difference, as long as they began to chant Hare Krishna. Carol. Whenever he had the chanting, the people were fairly in awe of the Swami. On the Bowery, a kind of transcendence came out of the ringing of the cymbals. He used the harmonium and many people played hand cymbals. Sometimes he played the drum. In the very beginning, he stressed the importance of sound and the realization of Godhead through sound. That was, I suppose, the attraction that these musicians found in him. The emphasis on sound as a means to attaining transcendence and the Godhead. But he wanted a serious thing. He was interested in discipleship. One serious newcomer was Michael Grant. Mike was 24. His father, who was Jewish, owned a record shop in Portland, Oregon, where Mike grew up. After studying music at Portland's Reed College and at San Francisco State, Mike, who played the piano and many other instruments, moved to New York City along with his girlfriend, hoping to get into music professionally. But he quickly became disenchanted with the commercial music scene. Playing in nightclubs and pandering to commercial demands seemed particularly unappealing. In New York, he joined the Musicians Union and worked as a musical arranger and as an agent for several local groups. Mike lived on the Bowery in an AIR loft on Grand Street. It was a large loft where musicians often congregated for jam sessions. But as he turned more and more to serious composing, he found himself retiring from the social side of the music scene. His interest ran more to the spiritual, quasi-spiritual, and mystical books he had been reading. He had encountered several swamis, yogis, and self-styled spiritualists in the city and had taken up Hatha Yoga. From his first meeting with the Swami, Mike was interested and quite open, as he was with all religious persons. He thought all genuinely religious people were good, although he did not care to identify with any particular group. Mike. There was a little bit of familiarity because I had seen other Swamis. The way he was dressed, the way he looked, older and swarthy, weren't new to me. But at the same time, there was an element of novelty. I was very curious. I didn't hear him talk when I first came in. He was just chanting. But mainly, I was waiting to hear what he was going to say. I had already heard people chant before. I thought, why else would he put himself in such a place without any comforts, unless the message he is trying to get across is more important than his own comfort? I think the thing that struck me the most was the poverty that was all around him. This was curious because the places that I had been before had been just the opposite, very opulent. There was a Vedanta center in Upper Manhattan and others. They were filled with staid older men with their leather chairs and pipe tobacco, that kind of environment. But this was real poverty. The whole thing was curious. The Swami looked very refined, which was also curious that he was in this place. When he talked, I immediately saw that he was a scholar and that he spoke with great conviction. Some statements he made were very daring. He was talking about God, and this was all new to hear someone talk about God. I always wanted to hear someone I could respect talk about God. I always liked to hear religious speakers, but I measured them very carefully. When he spoke, I began to think, well, here is someone talking about God who may really have some realization of God. He was the first one I had come across who might be a person of God who could feel really deeply. Prabhupada is lecturing. Sri Krishna is just trying to place Arjuna on the platform of working in pure consciousness. We have already discussed for so many days that we are not this dull body, but we are consciousness. Somehow or other, we are in contact with matter. Therefore, our freedom is checked. Attendance is better now than it had been uptown. The loft offers a larger space. In fact, the platform where Prabhupada sits nearly equals the area of his entire office cubicle on 72nd Street. The dingy loft with its unpainted rafters is more like an old warehouse than a temple. The members of his audience, most of them musicians, have come to meditate on the mystical sounds of the Swami's Kirtana. Carl, Carol, Gunther, Mike, David, the crowd from the Paradox, and others joined him on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday night when he holds classes beginning punctually at 8 o'clock. The program consists of half an hour of chanting Hare Krishna, followed by a lecture from Bhagavad Gita, usually 45 minutes long, then a question and answer period, and finally another half hour of chanting, everything ending by 10 o'clock. The Kirtana has just ended and Swamiji is speaking. As spiritual beings, we are free to act, free to have anything. Pure, no contamination, no disease, no birth, no death, no old age. And besides that, we have got many, many other qualifications in our spiritual life. When he speaks, he is pure spiritual form. The Vedic scriptures say that a sadhu, a saint, is not seen but heard. If the people in the audience want to know Swamiji, they will have to hear him. He is no longer simply the old Indian immigrant who lives on the other side of the partition of his loft, hanging his clothes to dry, barely getting his meals.
But now he's speaking as an emissary of Lord Krishna beyond time and space, and hundreds of spiritual masters in the chain of disciplic succession are speaking through him. He has entered New York's Bohemians in 1966, saying that 1966 is temporary and illusory, and that he is eternal and they are eternal. This was the meaning of the Kirtan, and now he is explaining its philosophically, advocating a total change in consciousness, yet knowing that they cannot take it all. He urges them to take whatever they can. You will be glad to hear that this process of spiritual realization, once began, guarantees one to have his next life as a human being. Once Karma Yoga is begun, it will continue. It doesn't matter. Even if one fails to complete the course, still he is no loser. He is not loser. Now, if someone begins this yoga of self-realization, but unfortunately cannot prosecute this task in a nice way, if he falls down from the path, still there is encouragement that you are not a loser. You will be given a chance next life. And the next life is not ordinary next life. And for one who is successful, oh, what to speak of him? The successful goes back to Godhead. So we are holding this class, and although you have multifarious duties, you come here thrice a week and try to understand. And this will not go in vain. Even if you are, even if you stop coming here, that impression will never go. I tell you, the impression will never go. If you do some practical work, that is very, very nice. But even if you do not do any practical work, simply if you give your submissive oral reception and understand what is the nature of God, if you simply hear and have an idea, even then you will be freed from this material bondage. He's speaking to a crowd who are deeply set in their hip life. He knows that they cannot immediately give up taking drugs, and there they sit with their common law rights. Their path is to play music, live with women, and meditate sometimes, and be free. After hearing this lecture, they will stay up all night with their instruments, their women, their drugs, their interracial bond will sing. Yet somehow they are drawn to Swamiji. He is good, he's got the good vibrations of the kirtan, and they want to help him. They're glad to help because he has no one else. So Prabhupada is saying to them, that's all right. Even if you can do only a little, it will be good for you. We are all created spirit souls, but you have forgotten. You have fallen into cycle of birth and death. Whatever you do towards reviving your original consciousness is good for you. There is no loss. The Swamiji's main stress is on what he calls downgrading your consciousness with the supreme consciousness. Krishna is the supreme consciousness, and Arjuna, as a representative individual consciousness, is asked to act intelligently in collaboration with the spiritual consciousness. Then he will be free from the bondage of birth, death, old age, and disease. Consciousness is a popular word in America. These consciousness expansion, consciousness, uh, altered states of consciousness, and now dovetailing the individual consciousness with the supreme consciousness. This is the perfection of consciousness. Prabhupada explains. This is the love and peace that everyone is really after. And yet Prabhupada talks of it in terms of war. They are talking on the battlefield, and Arjuna says, I will not fight. I will not fight with my relatives and brothers for the sake of achieving some kingdom. No, no. Now, to an ordinary man, it appears that, oh, Arjuna is a very nice man, non-violent. He has given up everything for the sake of his relatives. Oh, what a nice man he is. That is ordinary calculation. But what does Krishna say? He says, you are damn fool number one. Now just see the things which are estimated in the public eye are very nice, very good. That is condemned by God. So you have to see whether the supreme consciousness is pleased with your actions. And Arjuna's action was not approved by Lord Krishna. It was for his own will, sense gratification, that at first he would not fight. But in the end, for Krishna's satisfaction, he did fight. And that is our perfection. When we act for the satisfaction of the Supreme Consciousness. At this point, some in the audience are filled with reservations. They are all opposed to the role of the United States in Vietnam, and this idea is very difficult for them. Like Arjuna, want peace. So why is Swami sanctioning war? He explains, yes, Arjuna's idea not to fight is good, but then Krishna, the Supreme Consciousness, instructs him to fight anyway. Therefore, Arjuna's fighting is above mundane ethics. It's absolute. If we follow Arjuna, give up good and bad, and act for Krishna, not for our sense gratification, then that is perfect. Because Krishna is the supreme consciousness. To some in the audience, although his answer seems philosophically sound, it is not quite what they want to hear. Still, they want to know his political views. Does he support America's involvement in Vietnam? Is he anti war? But Prabhupada is neither hot nor dull. He has no political motive behind his example of Krishna and Arjuna. His theme is simple and pure, beyond the good and the bad and the absolute. And to act in accord with the absolute is also beyond good and bad. But what about Vietnam? Does Krishna say to fight there? No, Swamiji answers. The Vietnam war is different from the Kurukshetra war. In the Battle of Kurukshetra, Krishna was personally present, asking Arjuna to fight. Vietnam is different. But his audience had yet another objection. If he is not addressing the Vietnamese war, then why not? After all, this is 1966. If he isn't talking about the war, then what is his relevancy? The Swami replies that his message is actually the most urgent and relevant. The Vietnamese War was an inevitable karmic reaction. It was one symptom, not the whole problem. The only and only this philosophy, surrender to the supreme consciousness, addresses the real problem. But for many, the reference to fighting is so emotionally charged that they cannot go beyond the immediate politics of Vietnam to Prabhupada's real message of surrender to the Supreme Consciousness. They respect the Swami. They realize he is referring to a deeper philosophy. Yet the story of Arjun and the god makes things difficult. The Swami nonetheless continues to refer to Arjuna's fighting as a classic example of Bhagavad Gita's basic teachings. It is not the basic teachings his audience is given difficulty with. It is the example. Prabhupada has deliberately handed his audience a volatile analogy. He hasn't come to join the peace movement and he doesn't accept their short-sighted concept of peace. He confronts it. It is better to fight in Krishna consciousness than to live in a so-called peace devoid of God consciousness or realization. Yes, the example is hard for them to accept. It makes them think, and if they do accept, then they might come near to understanding the absolute. It is very difficult doubting our consciousness with the supreme consciousness. Not at all, not at all. No sane man will say, oh, it is impossible. He isn't suggesting to dovetail with the supreme consciousness. They will have to fight in Vietnam or perform some other heartfelt act on behalf of God. He knows that spiritual life will have to be more attractive than material life, or his audience will never take it. He wants to bring the theme of dealing with the supreme consciousness down to something practical, something all attractive and beautiful, something anyone could do and would want to do. He wants to encourage them by saying that they can do their own thing, but for Krishna, Arjun, after all, was a lifetime warrior. Krishna did not ask him to give up his work, but to do it for the Supreme. So, Prabhupada is asking the same for his audience, and they can begin with something as simple as offering their food to God. Because everyone has to eat. So, God wants to eat something. Why don't you first offer your food to God, then you eat it? But you may say, but if God takes it away, then how should I eat? No, no, God will not take it. Daily, after preparing our food stuffs, we are offering to Krishna. There is a witness. Mr. David has seen. Prabhupada laughs. God eats, but his spiritual eating is such that even after he is eating, the whole thing is still there. So we should not suffer a pinch if we dovetail our desires with the Supreme Lord. We simply have to learn the art how to dovetail. Nothing has to be changed. The fighting man did not change into an artist or a musician. If you are a fighting man, you remain a fighting man. If you are a musician, you remain a musician. If you are a medical man, you remain a medical man. Whatever you are, you remain, but dovetail it. If by my eating the Lord is satisfied, then that is my perfection. If by my fighting the Lord is satisfied, then that's my perfection. So, in every sphere of life, we have to know whether the Lord is satisfied. That technique we have to learn. Then it is easy as anything. We have to stop creating our own plans and thoughts and make and take the perfect plans from the Supreme Lord and execute them. That will become the perfection of my life. And Lord Chaitanya has made acting on the platform of Krishna consciousness very easy. Just as there are some note makers of school books, easy study, so Lord Chaitanya has recommended that you be engaged in whatever occupation, but just hear about Krishna. Continue to hear the Bhagavad Gita and chant Hare Krishna. It is for this that we are trying to organize this institution. So you have come, and whatever work you do, it doesn't matter. Everything will be adjusted by and by as our institution. So you have come, and whatever work you do doesn't matter. Everything will be adjusted by and by as our mind becomes clear simply by hearing. If you continue this process, chanting the Krishna mantra, you will practically see how much your heart is becoming clear and how much you are making progress towards spiritual realization, the real identity of your consciousness. Prabhupada is speaking on behalf of the Supreme Consciousness, and he offers his day-to-day activities as an example of dealing with the Supreme. I'm here always working at something, reading or writing, something, reading or writing, 24 hours. Simply when I'm hungry, I take something, and simply when I'm sleepy, I go to bed. Otherwise, I do not feel fatigued. You can ask Mr. David whether I am not doing this. Of course, the Swamiji's daily routine does not require certification from David Allen, and any of his regular visitors can see that he is transcendental. His personal life is a perfect example of dovetailing with the Supreme Consciousness. Prabhupada has always kept himself dovetailed with the Supreme. He had been perfectly dovetailed in Vrindavan also and had no personal need or motive to come to America and live on the Bowery. It was for others' sake that he came to the Bowery, and it is for others' benefit that he is speaking tonight. His spiritual master and Lord Krishna want the conditioned souls to come out of their illusion before it's too late. Speaking vigorously even until he became physically exhausted, sometimes shouting, sometimes pleading, sometimes laughing, he gave his audience as much as he feels they can take. As the emissary of Krishna and the disciplic succession, he can boldly shout that everyone should deal with the Supreme. He can ask as strongly as he likes for as long as they're willing to listen. He's a sadhu, the Sanskrit word saint, and one who cuts. And he repeats the same message that for thousands of years sadhus of the original Vedic culture have spoken. He is reviving the eternal spirit of the Vedic wisdom to cut the knots of ignorance and illusion. So everything is illusion from the beginning of our birth, and that illusion is so strong, it is very difficult to get out of it. The whole thing is illusion. Birth is illusion. The body is illusion. The bodily relationship and the country are illusion. The father is illusion. The mother is illusion. The wife is illusion. The children are illusion. Everything is illusion. And we are all contacting this illusion, thinking we are very learned, advanced. We are engaging so many things, but as soon as that comes, the actual fact, then we forget everything. We forget our country, we forget our relatives, we forget our wife, children, father, mother, everything is gone. My grant, I went up to him forward. I had the same feeling I had on other occasions when I had been to hear famous people in concerts. I was always interested in going by after concerts to see musicians and singers, just to meet them and see what they were like. I had a similar feeling after Swamiji spoke, so I went up and started talking. But the experience was different from others in that he wasn't in a hurry. He would talk to me, whereas all the others would say, would
All the others, whereas with others, all you could do was to get in a few words. They were always more interested in something else. But he was a person who was actually showing some interest in me as a person, and I was so overwhelmed that I ran out of things to say very quickly. I was surprised. Our meeting broke off on the basis of me not having anything further to say. It was just the opposite of so many other experiences where some performer would be hurrying off to do something else. This time it was I, the one who couldn't continue. Prabhupada liked to talk, Prabhupada liked to take walks. From his doorstep at 94 Bowery, he would see directly across the street the Fulton Hotel, a five-story flop house. Surrounding him were other lower Manhattan lodging houses where tenants wandered the sidewalks from early morning till dark. An occasional flock of pigeons would stir and fly from the rooftop to the next or descend to the street. Traffic was heavy. The Bowery was part of a truck route to from Brooklyn by way of the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges. The Bowery sloped gently downhill towards the north, and Prabhupada could see both sides a few craggy Manhattan trees and street lights and traffic signals as far up as 4th Street. He could see Con Edison with his prominent clock tower, and if there were no clouds, the top of the Empire State Building on the 34th Street. He could walk alone in the morning through the Bowery neighborhood. The month of the May that year was more frequent rains than normal, and Prabhupada carried his umbrella. Sometimes he walked in the rain. He was not always alone. Sometimes he walked with one of his new friends and talked. Sometimes he shopped. Watermelon, dal, ghee, chickpea flour, and other specialty foods common in Indian vegetarian cuisine were available in the Chinatown's nearby markets. On leaving the lot, he would walk south a few steps to the corner of Bowery and Hester Street. Turning right on Hester, he would immediately be in Chinatown, where the shops, markets, and even the Manhattan savings banks were identified by signs lettered in Chinese. Sometimes he would walk one block further south to Canal Street with his Central Asian food market and many other street side fruit and vegetable markets. In the early morning, the sidewalks were almost deserted, but as the shops began to open for business, the streets became crowded with local workers, shopkeepers, tourists, and aimless derelicts. The winding side streets of Chinatown were lined with hundreds of small stores and parked cars lined both sides of the street. He walked on Hester would sometimes take him to Little Italy, which overlaps Chinatown and Mulberry Street. In this neighborhood, places like Chinese pork products and the Mi Jiang Mi supermarket stood alongside Ambedkar's Ham House and the Puglia restaurant, advertising cappuccino la Puglia, coffee from Puglia. His walks west of Bowery in Chinatown and Little Italy were mainly for shopping, but he also noted perspective sites for a temple. Chantam Tower or Champang Square particularly drew his attention. Sometimes he would walk in the opposite direction as far as the East River and Brooklyn Beach. But when a friend warned him that the slipper had been flaring at strollers along the river, he stopped going there. Despite the bad neighborhood where Robert lived and walked, he was rarely disturbed. Often he would find several Bowery bunks asleep or unconscious at the door, and he would have to sleep over them. Sometimes it drunk simply out of his inability to maneuver would bump into him, or a derelict would mutter something unintelligible, or laugh at him. The more sober ones would stand and gesture courteously, ushering the Swami into or out of his door at 94 Bhavi. He would pass among them, acknowledging his good manners as he cleared his path. Certainly, few of the Bhavi men and others who he saw him on his walks knew much about the small, elderly Indian sadhu dressed in saffron and carrying an umbrella, a brown grocery sack. Sometimes Prabhupada would meet one of his friends on the street, Jan. Michael Grant's girlfriend met him on several occasions as he was walking Jan, I would see him in the midst of his potpourri of people down there walking down the street. He always had an umbrella and he would always have a serene look on his face. He would just be taking his afternoon jaunts, walking along, sometimes stepping over the trunks, and I would always get sort of nervous when I would meet him on the sidewalk. He would say, "Are you chanting?" And I would say, "Sometimes." And then he would say, "That's a good girl."